Well, hello, welcome everybody to the webinar Privacy 101, Where Do I Start? Brought to you today by LevelUP Consulting Group and OneTrust. My name is Dave Cohen. I'm a senior manager at the LevelUP Consulting Group, and I'm going to be your host for today's program. We're going to get started in just a minute with the program and the conversation, but before we do a few quick program details, if you're wondering about getting a copy of the slides, you can certainly do that. And I'm going to be providing my email address toward the end of the program. You can send me a quick note and we'll send off a copy of the slides to you. There will also be a follow-up email that will include a link to the recording. And by the way, we are recording this program. So you'll get a follow-up email from OneTrust with the recording link in there if you're wondering about that. And with that, one other thing, we want this to be an interactive conversation. So please feel free to post your questions in either the question and answer panel, which is down at the bottom of your screen for most of you, or the chat function. And we'll monitor that throughout. And we're going to take questions either during the program, or we're also going to try to reserve a little bit of time toward the end of the hour for those questions. And now with that, let's go ahead and get started. I want to give you a quick overview of the structure for today's conversation. In just a minute, we're going to kind of build from the bottom up and share with you kind of 6 essentials that we've identified as some building blocks for starting up a new privacy program. And we're going to speak to each of those, go into a little bit of depth. Then we're going to cover some of the what we're calling foundational privacy principles. These are well-developed guiding principles in a number of different formats that have been developed over the years by a number of different organizations. There are hyperlinks in the slides, so you can go and do further research on them, and we'll kind of touch on those quickly. We're then going to talk about one of the most important things for a successful privacy program, which is building key relationships with the essential departments that process personal information within your organization, and we'll go into some depth there. We're going to talk about when and how to get legal advice, which you will definitely want to be consulting. And there are times when it's good to go for internal advice and times to go out to external counsel. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit. Then we're going to share the kind of state of play with tools and technologies. And fortunately, there are a number of excellent tools available to help manage privacy programs these days. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we're going to leave some good time for audience questions and answers. So with that, let me introduce today's panelists. Andrew Clearwater is the Chief Trust Officer at OneTrust. Andrew is a licensed attorney, and in his role as Chief Trust Officer, he oversees the company's centers of excellence across privacy, security, data governance, ethics, ESG, and third-party risk. The centers provide counsel, leadership, and guidance on building more trusted organizations. Andrew's team is also responsible for providing public policy analysis on privacy, data security, information policy, and technology transactions. So a wide slew of responsibilities across the OneTrust organization. Andrew, welcome to the panel.
Thanks.
And joining Andrew on the panel today, Eric Dieterich is the Managing Director of the LevelUP Consulting Group. Eric has overall responsibility for developing and maintaining our client relationships, bringing unique service offerings to our clients, and steering LevelUP strategic goals. Eric's been providing consulting services for nearly 20 years to companies both large and small, public and private, across a broad spectrum of industries. His areas of expertise include privacy, data governance, cybersecurity, and risk management. Previous to LevelUP, Eric oversaw a team of nearly 200 employees providing consulting services focusing on privacy, cybersecurity, data governance, and audit. Eric, thanks for making some time for us on the panel
appreciate
today.
it. Happy to be here.
And with that, let's go ahead and get started. And I'm going to toss it over to Andrew to get started on the essentials of a startup privacy program.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. It's a good place to start. And yeah, let's start with getting buy-in from upper management. So we're truly looking at this as the beginning of a good global privacy program. Then you really need to know why you're there and what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Not all privacy programs begin to become super comprehensive solutions. They begin because there's a specific event or a problem has been identified. And so it's good to know if your driver might be to reduce complaints that have come in, or maybe there was a new law that was passed and now there's a sense that there's risk in not complying with it. Or maybe customer contracts came in that said, show us how you're accountable for this. And now like this is the source of the issue that I am here to solve. Work backwards from that to make sure that you at least address that before you go into other areas, because that kind of early win, so to speak, is going to be the measure of your early success. And early success is what leads to the ability to get more wins. You want to be trusted by the organization as someone who can deliver on what it is they were concerned about. So as exciting as it is to kind of get going on these new programs, you really kind of need to know what it is that someone expects of you. So knowing that can go a long way in your early program design, even when you know you have so many more tools and ideas about where you want to go with things. You've got to meet those baseline things. We're going to show you a lot of different ideas in terms of how to base things off of principles, tools that are available, and all of that throughout this program. But I think it's important too at the beginning when you're getting buy-in from upper management to know that you got to align to an organization's culture and process. You cannot just bring something that works somewhere else to your new organization and assume, yeah, this playbook's going to work again. And the reason for that is because you're working with people, right? All of them have something in place. And, one of the ways that I've been successful in the past in terms of introducing new privacy program elements is by asking people what they do today before I tell them what I want to do with them in the future. And this will certainly open up communication a bit better because you didn't just come blasting in with your new ideas, but also you can find ways of it kind of becoming part of an existing process, which is a way that you can kind of gain your way in when you don't have all the credibility of a larger program that already exists and everyone knows the reason for you being there and what you're doing. So that copy and paste element, if you avoid it and you listen to the business and you say, okay, I've got some goals and they're aligned to a business process that needs correction. Tell me what you do. Here's how we're going to work together. I've got some ideas. That has worked well for organizations in the past. It's worked well for me in the past. We've got two other thoughts on this, and then we'll kind of move to our next item. But having really clearly defined business owners for tasks is another important part of kind of early buy-in. People need to know what they're doing with you and for you in order to get things off the ground. At OneTrust, we have this concept that we refer back to called DRI, directly responsible individual. And that means that when we set something up, we know what people are responsible for within that kind of overall program, and it leads to clarity, right? That, this is what you're going to do in order for us to get to that overall goal. And by doing that early on, I see a big difference in the success of programs. And then finally, prioritizing privacy by design is part of what you're going to do. Maybe not the first thing, but maybe, making sure it happens. You need to make sure that you're going to get to that state where you can bake some of these processes into your organization. If you were listening in that first part and saying, what do you do here? How does it work? And what kind of tools do you use? It's going to be a lot easier as you're thinking through that to start the work of making some beneficial improvements where privacy decisions are being made earlier in processes, which won't, force you to correct them later. So a few tips to get you thinking about getting the right level of buy-in and how. And then why don't we switch now to starting to think about metrics, because the earlier the better, right?
Yeah, that's right. And all great points, Andrew. And I think, a lot of what you say plays into, the metrics that you might want to start considering from the very early onset of your privacy program, or maybe you're going through a kind of a revamp or an enhancement of your privacy program. And there's opportunity to introduce additional metrics or introduce new metrics. So there's a lot of different angles and directions you could go with metrics, but as Andrew was referring to, getting that buy-in of these programs from those various stakeholders is very important. And maybe one element that could be used is when you define those metrics early on, it'll help the various your business partners, business stakeholders, understanding what you're trying to achieve, and then also be able to kind of measure the success of the program. So often what we see is, start basic. Don't set the bar too high early on. So maybe it's watching certain metrics around how many data subject requests or consumer rights requests are coming in on a monthly basis. Do some trend analysis over quarters or maybe over the first year, and then start to potentially correlate that to events, a launch of a new site, a launch of a new product. Was there any uptick or decrease in those consumer right requests? And that could also go hand in hand with monitoring or measuring opt-out requests as well, because those indicators of your consumers and even your employee behavior could be a good value add that you could give back to the business to say, okay, when we launch that new site or new product, or we change the look and feel of this, we saw an uptick in activity. Maybe it was deletion, which would be maybe something we did wasn't received favorably, and to start to consider that. And as well as just general privacy inquiries that might be coming in outside of the normal. So tracking those, setting expectations on what you're going to do, how you might report those back to a committee, your various business stakeholders on a monthly basis, just so you could start to show additional value and what you're trying to accomplish through kind of reportable metrics. And then the last one I will mention on the metric side that I think we see quite often is, especially if you're going to start to further enhance privacy by design concepts or introduce a privacy impact assessment that maybe hasn't been done before. This is a way, and obviously the stakeholders' initial reactions might be, hey, this is going to slow down our development process. This is going to slow down the launch of a new product. This is going to slow down, launching a new marketing campaign. So I think being able to monitor and track with some metrics on, the amount of PIAs that might be coming in, and then also the duration of turnaround from the privacy. So if privacy through that process has an obligation to review those, maybe you could show, hey, we're turning around, any comments we have within 48 hours, 72 hours, within a week. It's not us slowing down the process, right? So it really helps give, substance behind, hey, this is doing its job. It's helping us identify those privacy risks. And you know what? It really hasn't slowed down the cycle, because here are the metrics to show how quickly we're pushing it through the process and the value that we're giving back to the teams. Those are just a few examples. Hopefully we'll those could be taken and kind of resonate with, your organization and how you might adopt one, two, or maybe all of them in addition to others to further enable, how the program will be watched by your peers, or how it will be received as you go and get that buy-in, which I think flows nicely into kind of our third bullet here is engaging those stakeholders. So Andrew talked about it from initial buy-in. Now we're talking about it from kind of the operational side, making sure that, it's clearly understood by those stakeholders what their role might be in the enhanced or the new privacy program operations. Hopefully you could convince them that it's not going to be much more on their side. Maybe some will be impacted a little bit and others won't be impacted at all. So making sure you're reaching out to them, as Andrew also referred to, kind of understanding what they're doing today and try to piggyback on existing processes, leverage the things that work well operationally today, and get those additional kind of privacy related checkpoints within that process embedded. And then, just last part on this is about committees. I know some organizations don't like to have a lot of committees, some have too many, but having some type of either quarterly or monthly committee where, you could listen to their feedback, listen to where, they're struggling, or where the privacy program might help them be better off. So maybe it's on the sales team. Maybe if you provide, they're getting a lot of questions about, the privacy and security of your product. And if you hear that through a committee, maybe you could work directly then with the person in charge of your sales or business development to say, okay, we'll work on putting together, some marketing material that you could give your salespeople that will enable them to have that initial conversation around the strength of this, and then maybe it'll lead to less work or additional wins on their side. So just some examples to how as you engage those stakeholders, you could use it to proactively, better the organization and put your efforts out there to them. So,
Eric, quick question, actually for both of you, just tying all these three together here. I wonder if you might touch on a little bit something that I've heard discussed about in young privacy programs when you're starting to measure these metrics and setting these, Eric, you mentioned very importantly early on that don't be overly ambitious, make sure that you set a reasonable bar and reasonable expectations. Setting expectations is really key. With regards to some of these metrics that may be perceived as, putting up a little bit of a yellow flag or red flag, for instance, maybe an incident that's happening, if all of a sudden you're putting increased awareness and attention on certain incidents, isn't there a little bit of danger with your internal stakeholders that you're going to be flagging these things? There's going to be a little bit of, whoa, now that you're looking at them and measuring them, it looks like they've just emerged on the scene. They were actually there before, they just weren't being paid attention to. So I wonder if you might just kind of touch on that and the importance of setting proper expectations. And, maybe if we're going to be looking at these things now, please be aware we're going to discover things and we're going to remediate them. Is that fair enough?
Yeah,
I think so. Go ahead, Andrew. That's it.
I'll say one mitigating thing that you can think about early on is to make sure that all your metrics aren't volume metrics, because those the volume metrics will spike with the awareness, as you point out, and that is a common problem. But if there's something like customer satisfaction scores or something that's coming back from a department that isn't necessarily yours, that might trend more slowly, or kind of consider some sort of aggregate function that you are not going to see immediately rocket in one direction, that can help kind of show an overall picture of stability in some areas and change in another. Because if you did just choose, well, we didn't do PIAs and now we do a million, that's not going to really explain much to the business. So go ahead, Eric, on your thought too.
No, those are all valid points. I think we covered off on the importance of having the right mix of those metrics, so that you're right. It's not just all kind of volume. And to Dave's point, I think really working and discussing what they're going to be prior to going out and actually starting to track or measure them, right? So that's kind of that proactive outreach. Get the business partners to agree that this is important and it'll show value, not just for the privacy office, but for the other stakeholders that it might impact. And I think that way, Dave, as you alluded to, maybe there's a little bit less threatening aspect of monitoring and measuring when you have their buy-in and agreement that these make sense for the business.
Perfect.
Yeah. You can use some of this feedback loop as well, though, for our next point, which is making sure that you're staying dynamic and not static. You can learn from the incidents, maybe that now people are aware that they need to report and are reporting, and use that to make changes to your program or maybe make changes to your plans. One of the things I've seen that's a way to make sure that things are changing is to set goals. Maybe you do it quarterly, maybe you do it annually. But it allows you to recognize, why you're there in the first place and what you got buy-in for, and then march towards it. But you're not always going to be there for that original reason. And you need to recognize that and kind of move the program forward to address the new business needs that come up. So making sure that there's kind of an end point to your goal and the need to reset it can be a good way to ensure there's kind of a fresh perspective for your program on a regular basis. Another tool that you might not want to employ immediately, but can help, is audits and monitoring. If you get feedback from other people and third parties, they're going to be able to give you advice about areas that need attention. They're going to show you areas of strength and weakness. And that's another way to make sure that your systems don't stay static. They're going to move forward. And then making sure that there's a way to kind of enable change management. If you never explain from the beginning that this is the first version of the vendor process, but should we need to revisit it, here's how we're going to do that, you're going to put yourself in a tight spot. So change management, audits and monitoring, and annual goals, I think, are all useful tools to address that. Systems remaining dynamic and not static. And then Eric, if you want to maybe bring us into the mapping of data.
Yeah. So as it's that the part of the building and the foundation that often gives a lot of people a lot of pause, a lot of concern and sometimes even overwhelming in its efforts about making sure you fully understand the information life cycle of the personal information and or other confidential business sensitive data that's important for your organization, both from a consumer customer side, as well as now, even more importantly, with the CPRA and others state laws coming out here in the US, employee data. So this is an important element. It definitely acts as the foundation of any privacy program. And just, if going through and once again, starting potentially in certain areas, focusing your attention on groups or pockets of the business where there's more personal information being collected, used, maybe transmitted to other third parties, and then ultimately resides within the organization. So really fully understanding, that mapping, understanding the life cycle of that data, we always say is key, because it's really, really hard to have operationalize your program efficiently when you don't necessarily know what data you're dealing with, the types of data and the activities that might follow. So for example, is it possible to have a highly accurate privacy notice on your website when you're talking about the different uses or where that data might be going, when you don't really have that full understanding, right? So it gives you that additional comfort that any disclosures you might be making or statements you might be making publicly are accurately reflecting what's happening in your environment. So that's just one piece. When you have consumer rights requests come in or some type of data subject rights requests come in, are you able to act appropriately? Do you know where to go to remove that data? Do you know where to go to access the data and build that profile and give it back to the individual? And then also when it comes to evaluating privacy risk or building controls and tiering them, appropriately for the parts of the business where there is that more sensitive data. So, making sure that you're aware of where those sensitive data types are and those additional controls or additional obligations that you might have as an organization to protect that data. So really it's really that fundamental piece. And there's different ways to go about it. There's a little bit more of the foundational building, which might require some type of questionnaires or assessments that are sent out. Maybe it's facilitated workshops where you get key stakeholders in a room for 90 minutes. And you'd be surprised on how much information could be gathered if you bring a few colleagues together, maybe in the marketing department, and you're kind of whiteboarded out and you really just talk through it. You probably get a lot of good information about, what types of data sets are we collecting? Where are they coming from? What are those core key systems that we're using? What are those key third parties that we're passing, different agencies we might be passing that data to? So, don't feel that it has to be that 100% right off the bat, because then, if you try to do that, often we see these programs fail because it's really, really hard to get there. But if you could get 80, 90% there and really start to build off that and then go deeper phase 2, phase 3, that's where we see success. So I think it's very important, this information mapping, at least some element to be started very, very early on in the program.
Yeah. All right.
That's
so
really key, Eric. I was just going to say quickly that it's very easy to get overwhelmed. We've seen some data asset maps that are really large, and it's get started, move forward, it'll start building, have faith that it will start building, and don't seek 100% is a really great tip.
Yeah, know that, according to point 4, you're going to come back to it and you're going to build upon it, right? So just like a product team that creates the minimum viable version of itself, you got to start somewhere, and then you can iterate upon it. So, our last bit of advice for getting started really is kind of knowing what the requirements are. And those requirements often come from laws, and finding the laws that are applicable to you can actually be a bit tricky in itself. For one, you've got to think about jurisdiction and territory. Where are you, the company? Focus on that first. Think about where your offices are, think about where your headquarters are. But then you've got to think about a little wider than that. Where are my customers? Where are my vendors? Where are some of these business partners that might influence the scope of laws that are applicable to you depending on their activities? You might have all these outsourced functions, right? And you want to bring those into play. Another way that you can think of things besides jurisdiction is also sector, right? And there are lots of laws that affect healthcare versus telco versus, you know, HR issues. Well, that's not a sector, but you know what I mean? There are these topical groupings that you might go into that people have come before you and said, this is a group of laws that you should be paying attention to. And you can use that as you're building your program as a way to get started, knowing that this is what's applicable. Mapping those requirements, though, to your compliance structure is the next job. And you can't just, you know, read each one in isolation and keep adding them like new programs, right? So if one law says that there are privacy rights that you need to respond to, and the next law does too, well, then you have privacy rights as part of your program with two laws that you're complying with. And so you've got to make sure that you're bringing that back to something common so that people will be able to act in a consistent manner about it, but according to the law specifically. And staying up to date is kind of the next challenge around this. I mean, you might do this once, but just like, you know, point 4, you've always kind of got to be gazing at the horizon and informing the business that, hey, this is going to be effective next year. I might need budget, I might need people, I might need tools, so that you're not surprising the business with, you know, we've got a big project and not enough time to do it. And this will kind of transition to our next slide, but establish one global program. You've got to look for some commonality so that you are building something that's repeatable. And so some companies that we talk to, they use the GDPR because, you know, it sets a high bar. So they say, okay, I'm going to use that because it had so many requirements and it was a big project. And then I'm going to kind of hang everything else different off of that. Other good bases for a program that might come from standards or guidelines or other best practices. And it might be worth just kind of going into our next slide to think about what is foundational that kind of goes across these different laws. So we'll take a look here. I mean, this is mostly good news, right? I mean, a lot of the things we've talked about are things that are hard because there are many different versions of them. It's just going to keep changing. It's different. The principles are something that brings things together, boils things down, gives you them at their most basic form, what's common among things. And to me, this is kind of, you know, for those that are starting out, that like decoder ring for reading a law even. You know, you can look for these things in the laws that come out and realize, that's how it's going to map to what I have today or what it is that I want to build. And these have been built over the years as foundational ways of viewing what is required for privacy to be effective. And you'll see here that we actually have these as hyperlinks. So if you do request these slides, you'll be able to go and do the research on your own to kind of dig into these. The OECD, the Fair Information Privacy Principles, those were used in the very beginnings of privacy law to get everyone kind of off the ground. But since then, there have been versions that we've built upon that, like the privacy by design principles, which kind of further show how you can bring that into your company and make sure that privacy is happening up front and not later on. As well as, you know, the GDPR, which is only it's in our rearview mirror, but not that far. Where it adopted many of the prior principles, but kind of restated them in a way that has some specificity. So looking at a modern privacy program, focusing on the GDPR for a moment, let's just kind of name some of these just so you have a sense for them, though we're not going to, you know, kind of, it's not the lesson on what every single one of them is, you know, but lawfulness, fairness, and transparency, you know, how is that built into your program? That actually has to be, you know, put into practice. There are purpose limitations that have to be considered. What does it mean to minimize data in the context of your program? It might be different in the vendor context than your HR context, but each one of these processes that you're putting in place is considering these foundational principles. What are you doing to ensure accuracy? You know, you have to build structures that start with collection, but also start to address things throughout the data lifecycle that Eric was talking about. What are some storage limitations you want to put in place? How do you ensure integrity and confidentiality? And where are you going to demonstrate accountability? I mean, largely these programs get built in such a way that you're able to justify to the business what you're doing, but that's not your only audience, right? You need to have the external audience considered. You can't just say, well, they'll read the notice, they'll get what we're up to. There are many different ways that you're going to have to demonstrate accountability. And hopefully there isn't a regulator audience that you have to demonstrate accountability to, but you should be operating in such a way that you're prepared to do so, and that it isn't a gathering exercise so much as a filtering exercise to produce those materials and show what your program's all about. Now, it's not listed here, but I think it's worth mentioning. If we're just thinking about what are the common elements that can help you bring a program together, there are standards as well. So we know that NIST has a privacy framework, and we know that ISO 27701 is kind of a management program. Both of these can be useful tools as well. NIST more so for kind of figuring out categories of controls and bringing things together. There's also an element there of kind of looking at maturity over time, which addresses some of that improvement over time that I was speaking to earlier. The ISO standard 27701 is a management program. And so that, again, is looking at basically, how do we do decision making? How are we going to have continuous improvement? It's not as heavy on the controls, though. It is mapped to your obligations and ensures that those are in place. But that might be another place that you go to as a fundamental first step in program building that says, why am I doing this? And what principles or standards are going to help me get there? And you don't want to answer that in the middle, right? You could, but it'll hurt more. You kind of want to do that early on, and it might depend on the problem you're solving and maybe the skill set of those around you. Familiarity can sometimes drive a lot of the decision making here.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you brought up the NIST privacy framework, because I think I believe it was a publication, a survey that OneTrust did with, I think it was A.A.A. late last year, where they surveyed around that on what framework or what regulatory standard are you basing your privacy program. Number one was GDPR, as you mentioned, but it seemed like NIST was either number 2 or 3 in there pretty quickly, and then followed by some other regulatory standards. So I think similar to what we're seeing out there in the market 3 or 4 years ago, everyone was, if you wanted to kind of benchmark your program, we saw it against GDPR for the most part. Right. Now it seems like it's very much kind of that NIST is growing as that kind of industry framework to maybe have that initial foundation built off and then incorporate the regulatory requirements. So no, great point there.
Great. Well, let's keep moving.
Great. So yeah, we'll just cover off a little bit more. I know we touched on it briefly about, getting that engagement and building those relationships with those key departments. So we said early on is key, and engaging those stakeholders for various regions, as we mentioned, whether it's establishing metrics, understanding their program operations today to figure out where you could help them better evaluate that privacy risk, because that's ultimately what it's about. Understanding, one, what are contractual regulatory requirements, and then how do we embed that within the business to ensure there's those key trigger points that'll help us better understand what that risk is, or how it's changing within the organization. So there's different, depending on what industry you're in, the size and complexity of your organization. Some of these areas mentioned, these functional teams that we mentioned, might be more relevant than others within your group. Often there's that initial outward facing functional team. So whether that's your customer service, whether it is more your sales team, whether it's your marketing team doing various campaigns, both digitally and maybe through other means, but engaging them early on, building those relationships. So how do you go about doing that, right? I think there's a few different ways. I think as Andrew alluded to when we started off, getting that initial buy-in. So as you're going around and talking and having these one-off conversations on what this program is going to mean for the organization, what you're trying to do with it, but then soliciting feedback at the same time. So initially having those one-on-one meetings, we see to be quite successful. more casual conversation, maybe kind of visually show, hey, this is kind of what we're trying to achieve. This is why we're doing it. As also we mentioned earlier on, is it a contractual obligation? Is it a regulatory driven based on the geographic region we operate in? Or are we using it as a competitive advantage? And this is what we need to do in order to kind of stay competitive in our space. So all those things come into play in having those conversations. Then when it comes to kind of ownership and roles and responsibilities of these privacy program functions moving forward, I think it's making sure that there's clear definition of that, whether it's through a more formal kind of RACI that, some groups will be responsible, some more informed and so forth. That could be a helpful tool that could be discussed and communicated with your various team members. So that's one. And then also kind of two last pieces here. One, privacy champion programs are pretty common. And the whole idea being that there's some privacy advocate within the functional teams. And whether they're just part of a group that gets together once a month, whether they're the first line of contact for privacy related questions within that functional team that then get fed back up to the privacy program, it really depends on how much time those champions could allocate. If they can only allocate an hour a month, then it's more of awareness, and then that person or people are then engaged within the business on a day-to-day, but at least they have more awareness. And then the other thing we think is quite successful is I mentioned it earlier, some type of a committee that brings these functional team members together. And maybe you could already have a security committee, maybe you have a client compliance committee, and maybe privacy initially just gets a 15-20 minute carve out of those meetings, maybe a 10-minute carve out to talk about the initiatives going on. I think all those things with open communication, soliciting feedback, bringing them along the way as you design these programs is only going to help you. When we see I think where we see programs fail on the operational side, they might have good policy and good structure to it. But when there is kind of things pushed on people where they feel it's being pushed on them without socialization before, they could very much close down, make it very, very hard for you to roll out privacy impact assessments because you just can't get them to complete it no matter what, right? So it's that solicitation engagement early on is where we see the most success here.
Yeah, back to your previous point, Eric, about setting realistic, attainable goals, starting small, and then building out from there. Being respectful of people's time, really, really critical.
Yeah, but let's get a little deeper on another topic too, which is kind of getting legal advice, which is an important part of this, but it's a difficult part. I mean, seeking advice assumes a lot of things, and one is that you even are aware of the problems that you face. So hopefully some of the things we talked about prior to this actually get you to that point. You typically are not seeking legal advice as you start a program. It's because aspects of your program need some attention. So it could be those privacy champions or others that Eric was mentioning are bringing you issues now that you realize that I'm not sure if we can solve those without additional information. And when you look at this initially, one of the things to remember is that law firms are vendors too, if we're thinking about externally what's going on, and you don't want to forget that and then go into this without having done the work that you do with other vendors, privacy reviews, security reviews, how this is going to be confidential. All of that is an important piece to consider, and it's what gets you ready to use them in the first place. And knowing too that there are specialists within privacy, right? Our field is broad. So if we go back to my comment about the laws, that the healthcare sector is somewhat special within privacy, making sure that you're selecting the experts within the privacy field that are going to be best suited for you. Just because there is a privacy portion of the law firm that you're going to doesn't mean that they're going to be the best fit for your company. So doing that work ahead of time to make sure that okay, this is the group that fits me and is going to be the best one to answer this question. I flag here that for incident response reasons, because that might be one of the compelling reasons to go to an outside counsel, you definitely want to do the work early on so that you can go to them and it's all prior, set up and arranged. You don't want a vendor contract being exchanged. You don't want to wonder which, person's the best one to go to at this time. And if you really want to think ahead too, you should probably see if you have some cyber coverage that says you can go to a law firm. Well, do they agree that the law firm that you're planning to go to is one that they're going to give you, a good deal on? How much are they going to cover, et cetera? They might give you a list that says, here's kind of the safe list to choose from. And all of that takes time. And so some of my advice here so far has just been a lot of preparing to use counsel rather than using counsel, but that's a big part of it. You are talking about spending your money wisely and your time wisely. So formulating the question, knowing who's the best to answer it, and then getting to those people with all of the prep work complete is kind of the biggest part of making sure that you get the right legal advice. Now, that said, I've been talking as if internal counsel doesn't exist, and it certainly does, right? So well, it might not, but in a lot of companies it does. And so what you're going to find with internal counsel, I think, is that they're always going to know more about the context of your business, and therefore there's some real advantages to speaking to them about your problem and the context of your business. But the advantage of outside counsel is that they have more exposure to the issue overall, right? If you've seen 100 of these things happen, you have more advice about how things might turn out or what commonly works best. And that is the advantage of any kind of advisory services, essentially, is that exposure allows you to get advice that comes from exposure through experience to the issue. So largely these problems are not solved by one or the other. It's bringing in the advice that comes from exposure and experience to the group that understands your business in its current context to solve a problem. And if you've done this preparation that we talk about here, you'll be sort of in the best position ahead of time to know how much you can spend and who to go to and how to go get your answers. So hopefully that helps you get down that road. Obviously there's more that can be done, but we're just trying to get things off the ground here.
Yep.
Right. Well, let's get into tools and technologies. And this is something that I think that both Eric and I would like to say something on. It's also an opportunity for you to start thinking about some of the questions you have as well, because this is one of our last things that we want to go over before we open it up. And I'm sure you're starting to think of a few questions as we do so. So, one of the things to think about here, I suppose, is really, what is your starting point? And that might go all the way back to slide 1.1, which is, why are you here and how are you getting this upper level management buy-in? Tying your selection of technology to the buy-in is probably a good idea. I mean, there may be some underlying things that have to be done that you have to explain the connection, but if you go into this, trying to solve a vendor problem, then I think you probably know where your tooling should be focused. And the advantage of looking at tooling that is integrated into a common platform is it's something that you can grow into. I think we all know that when you approach a privacy program, you can only focus on a few things at a time. And so that's going to be important. You want compatibility between the tools you put in place, and you want a platform that allows you to make a few choices now and then more choices later, so that you can scale. This is part of that other point that we said, which is that your program is going to be dynamic. Don't just get it all or know it all at the beginning. You're going to grow into it. So some folks will choose to do what Eric was talking about earlier, which is making sure you know your data. And that is good advice. I think that is the general advice that we give most customers, which is make sure you get that data mapping in place. And if you put the data mapping in something like a spreadsheet, you're already going to be running into point 4 on our first slide, which is, well, how repeatable is this going to be? Is it going to be dynamic, or did you just tuck something in a drawer that you're going to have to basically start from scratch on a year from there? So looking at that dynamic idea, knowing where your data is, data mapping is in general good advice. Secondarily, knowing why you're there, you might choose some tooling that connects to what upper management is concerned about. And kind of third, before I hand this over to Eric, is knowing where you need to gain some efficiencies. Look at the people that you have, and look at the problems that you have, and figure out what types of repeatable tasks could be automated in order to make you more effective. If you're receiving, 2 data rights requests per month, let's not automate that. That doesn't sound like that's going to be your problem, right? But, if one of your issues is you have data all over the planet and people are constantly changing where it's located and adding new products to it, well, then data discovery and classification sounds like an important way that you're going to be able to stay on top of what's important in your business, and a type of automation that would otherwise mean lots of meetings, lots of calls, the development of many privacy champions, et cetera. And so this is why we said kind of early on that not every program is going to be copy and paste. You're going to recognize the challenges you face and find the tooling to match. So what's some of your advice, Eric?
Yeah, no, I think you definitely covered off on some of the very important things, and it's growing into it, starting with the areas that help with building the foundation and make it repeatable and sustainable as well. So as you mentioned, if you're just getting started, maybe you have limited resources able to kind of support the initiative, and maybe you haven't done an information map. Data mapping might be a very good start, because it's the relational nature of especially of the OneTrust platform as well that really adds value down the road. So you think, hey, we're going to spend some effort, we're going to build our data maps, the various inventories associated with that around our assets, the different entities that might be involved, the processing activities, and the third parties. And then we're saying, okay, then we want to build out that PIA program. We want to really start, evaluating risks as things are changing in the business. Now, the great thing about, leveraging a tool like OneTrust for that is now you could say, okay, what activity or what asset or what processing activity or is this all related to? And you could start building that linkage that then provides much more valuable business intelligence around, okay, if we're trying to do something, it has high privacy risk, what parts of the business might that impact, and are we okay with that? And you could kind of see that much more efficiently through those linkages. So I think just highlighting that and the importance of scaling appropriately. And I know OneTrust does a good job, even for our smaller accounts that are just getting going, being able to kind of piecemeal it as you build or as you scale and get more mature, get more complex, or have more resources dedicated. You could build into it, so it's not this monumental task from day one. So I think that that's another key thing. I think it's always easier to kind of build on what you have within a tool rather than go down the route of more spreadsheets, a very static process, and then trying to you have a lot done, and now you're trying to kind of change the program, reorganize. I'm not saying it can't be done at all, but if you have the option, it's always a little bit easier, I think, to start with the tool, scale it appropriately, and then grow into it.
Yep. And these tools here we're talking about are important, but one additional area we want to address is kind of knowing the right information. And so if we take a look at the next slide, we point out, knowing your laws, having the right intelligence to support the requirements building that you're going to need to have for your organization is critical. And that is something that, at OneTrust, I lead the team that puts together this intelligence. We have a contributor network, which you can see here is quite large and quite critical. Having the people that are, in the country that are the legal experts on that topic allows us to deliver information quickly and accurately, in addition to the partnership they have with our in-house lawyers that are putting information together as well. So in tracking that, we put together in a platform called Data Guidance, twice daily news. We've got impact analyses and larger, notes and materials that help you understand what's coming out and how it relates back to some of the elements of your program that you already have in place. And, this is the type of thing that can help you gain credibility within your organization as well. If you can give contextual and, up-to-date alerts to others on your team or the surrounding business units, it can establish you kind of as a knowledge leader within the organization, bring you some kind of leverage in future conversations where they're saying, oh, you know, he's really on top of things, he knows what's going on. That's going to make it a little more easy to have those future conversations. We have another slide here that kind of shows more comprehensively what some of these materials might look like. It does help to kind of give you a bit more detail, but I think you're understanding the value that comes from getting a newsletter that includes the important updates in each jurisdiction daily, and being able to dig into those with kind of comparison tables and opinions from legal experts around the world helps simplify your research. These are secondary materials that point to primary materials. So you're not combing through endlessly these kind of long PDFs. You're actually getting from people the succinct points on this is what you need to do, here's how you need to do it. So practitioner focused materials. So with that, I think we can open it up to those questions that we have hopefully been getting.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Eric, for some fantastic insights on how to get started and how to plan for growth, how to build, how to set reasonable goals when you're just getting started. We do have a couple of good questions in the queue. Of course, now in the little less than 10 minutes we have remaining in the hour is a great time for you to type your questions either into the chat or into the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Let me start with this one just because we were just touching on the importance of, and one of the most kind of foundational or fundamental tasks is a data mapping, data discovery exercise. And we have a question here from the audience about one of the sometimes challenging issues, which is mapping unstructured data. So that is data, that personal information that is in places throughout the organization, not as neatly organized as in a database or a spreadsheet. So Andrew, do you care to take a stab at that one?
Sure. I mean, some of this might be a tooling question, right? You know, like how could you gather that information in the first place? And it will depend on the tool. I mean, hopefully you'd be able to find a tool like ours that would be able to kind of look into the system that you have and gather that information and put it into categories. And that would be the best case scenario, right? This is a scenario where you are really going to just be then organizing the data that comes from the tool and making it relevant to your program. That said, I mean, not everyone's going to have the ability to get access to that right away. And using questionnaires and people who know what's in those systems is a secondary way that you can try to at least infer from internal experts some of the information you need to be accountable. I mean, to bring it back to some of those principles that we spoke about earlier, you know, you can't assume perfection when you're building something. So I'm trying to be reasonable, I guess, in answering this question, saying, look, you know, you might originally just know what other experts in the company know, and you could build from there by adding tooling and expertise on top of that as you build newer and better versions of your map. And I don't know, Eric, if you've got some experience
very
working
much
with others on that.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, there's kind of two parts when we look at unstructured data, and they relate back exactly what you said. There's the tooling aspect, but then there's also the process aspect. And that's where we see a lot of companies be challenged, because they might say, oh, we have an enormous amount of unstructured data on our SharePoint. You know, maybe there's a process where it's all up in Box or whatever the platform might be, where there's just so much unstructured data that's built up over time. So I think often to get your arms around, okay, great, we could run a tool on one of those platforms, but you know what? You're going to find a lot of personal data. Then what? And then you're going to have these, and then you're going to say, okay, great, we found it, which we often hear companies do when we get brought in. Oh my God, we have millions of records or hundreds of thousands of records. What are we going to do? And then usually our first question is, well, is it supposed to be there? Is that part of the business process where, you know, maybe as an order is fulfilled, a report gets stored in a SharePoint file and it has all the customer details on it? So I think understanding fundamentally what the business process is, where those data stores are supposed to be, and then use the tooling to help either confirm that that's where the only place it is, and or, hey, this is a legacy process, been around for many, many years. We don't even know what kind of data they were capturing years ago. We know today what we're capturing and putting in there, but you know what? Let's use a tool like you guys have at OneTrust and say, let's go and categorize all that data. Let's make sure our assumptions are correct. So I think organizations that take that approach rather than jumping right into scanning, which these unknown repositories, is great, but then you're kind of working a little bit backwards. And we often see more success working the other way. Obviously, it depends on, the complexity of your technology stack, the complexity of your organization, how long is it, you've been doing the same process for 20 years or 20 months, right? There's a lot of factors that come into play, but building that strategy on how you're going to manage and go and look at unstructured data is the best approach, and then leverage tools and or process to manage through it.
Terrific, thanks. We've only got a couple minutes here. I think we've got time for about one more question. Eric, I'm going to stick with you for a minute for this next one, just because it touches on something you spoke about earlier in the program, which is around metrics. We have a question in from the audience about measuring customer satisfaction as a metric. And I'm going to assume this has to do with particularly how personal and sensitive information is being managed within the organization. And let me just kind of tack on to this a little bit, that what we've seen, anybody involved in the privacy space over the last few years, I mean, obviously privacy is headline news everywhere, all throughout the world. So customers, consumers are starting to really care about who they do business with and whether they're going to be trusted to manage their information well. So do you want to talk a little bit about that, about the importance of, and maybe some ways that customer satisfaction with regards to how personal information is handled can be measured?
Yeah, I'll start that off, and then I'm sure Andrew has some thoughts there as well. They definitely come across that and build trust with their clients. Yeah. So I think a couple things. There's a lot of different thoughts on what the best approach is and what organizations comfort of. The most kind of, I think, outward facing is we actually have a few accounts that send those customer satisfaction surveys at the conclusion or during the service or product or the relationship that they had with that customer. And as part of that customer satisfaction survey, they're asking about more on the trust side. Were you asking them not like, hey, what do you think about our privacy policies? But it's more of, hey, did you feel comfortable giving us your information? Were we clear and transparent about what we were doing with the data? So I've seen to that extreme. Now, obviously, every company is not comfortable asking those type of questions of their client. And then the other one is, these trust centers that are kind of more and more popping up on websites. So not just having your privacy notice, but almost a whole kind of landing page where it talks about the different activities, and it creates a much more transparent way of viewing, and explaining your privacy practices. And then the more transparent you are, in theory, if there are concerns, you would see those come back through some type of inquiry. But Andrew, in the final few minutes, I'll let you chime in a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two areas that you've pointed to, but I'll just add to it where you can learn some things. I mean, support desks are designed to deal with escalations, and they have categories and they have satisfaction scores. So ensuring that a category of addressing, privacy concerns as part of that process would allow you to get a subset of that information, and they probably already have those satisfaction scores as part of their process already. Now you could say over time we had X volume of privacy related, and the resolution led to their already existing TIMP, and that'll tell you something, right? Another place that's a little closer to the privacy office is the rights requests, because you're probably involved with them, and it's not another department that's the start of that process. And because of that, you can learn from that several things. I mean, whether you're getting things done on time and all of that could lead to satisfaction and accountability, but you could add in your own kind of temperature of response to that. But to your point, Eric, maybe that's not the first thing that you do. You might want to kind of infer things and learn things and get to a certain point of maturity before you add that in. But knowing that you have two key processes that you can measure from, and growing into a more sophisticated measurement, I think allows you to learn something about the business and how well you're being perceived.
Fantastic. And with that, we are just about to the top of the hour here. So A huge thank you, Andrew, for providing some of your valuable time for everybody out here in the audience today, and Eric, you as well, for joining us here on the panel. And it's just been a real pleasure putting this together. Big shout out to OneTrust for offering this partnership, and it's always great to work with the OneTrust folks here at LevelUP Consulting Group. As I mentioned at the beginning of the program, if you are interested in getting a copy of the slides, we'd be more than happy to send them to you. The best way to do that is to send me an email. I'll respond to you directly. My address is on the screen in front of you now. It's dave.cohen@levelupconsult.com. Just send me a note. We'll get that a PDF of the slides right off to you. And also, if you're interested in learning more about LevelUP Consulting Group, our consultations, that's also the best way to get in touch with us if you'd like to do some follow-up with regards to that. So one last time, huge thank you and shout out to Eric and Andrew for your time today on the panel, to all the people working in the background of the OneTrust and LevelUP teams to help make this program possible today. And with that, we'll let everybody get off to the rest of their days. And thank you for joining us. And we'll take us to a program close. Thanks very much, everybody.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.